You don't know me, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the only guy in the room who was smiling with his face while his eyes looked completely shattered. You don't know me, she said, her hand already reaching for mine before I even caught a clear look at her face. Come dance with me, just one song. After that, if you still want to be alone, I'll let you go. I'd been standing right at the edge of the dance floor at my best friend's wedding, nursing a glass of something I wasn't actually drinking, trying to figure out how soon I could slip away without anyone noticing. Then she materialized out of the crowd like she'd been sent on a mission. Dark dress, dark hair, and eyes that looked like they'd spent all night laughing right up until the moment they started crying. Just one dance, she said. I don't dance. Neither do I. Without missing a beat, she plucked the glass right out of my hand and set it on a nearby table without even looking. That's why it's only one. The band struck up a slow number. She took my hand, and I let her. That was song number 1. By the time the final track played hours later, we hadn't sat down once. And I need you to understand this. Before the night was through, I knew things about this woman that her closest friends had no clue about, and she knew secrets of mine I'd never spoken aloud to anyone. In just 4 hours on a crowded dance floor, we built something most people don't manage to construct in 4 years. This is the story of 5 songs, and how every single one of them completely upended my life. Let me rewind for a second, not too far, because this story doesn't need 10 years of backstory. It only needs one night. My name's Cole Sullivan. I'm 33, and I work as a carpenter out in Dayton, Ohio. I build things, mostly custom furniture, bookshelves, dining tables, fireplace mantles, the kind of heavy, honest woodwork that breathes life into old houses. But the gig that actually pays the bills? Wedding venues. I build the stages, the garden arbors, and the dance floors. Over the past 5 years, I've built the backdrop for roughly 60 weddings. My mornings start with hauling lumber, framing it, sanding it down to a buttery finish, and then, come the wedding day, I stand quietly in the back, watching total strangers twirl across something I crafted with my own calloused hands. Once the reception hits its stride, I go home to an empty house. 60 weddings under my belt, and I had never once set foot on the dance floor myself. I was at this particular one because the groom, Tyler Rhodes, has been my brother from another mother since we were 12 years old. I built his entire venue from scratch, the wooden arch, the polished floor, the head table. I did it entirely for free, refusing to let him pay a dime. I told him the timber was my wedding gift to him. Yet, there was something I hadn't confessed to Tyler, or to a single other living soul. It was the exact reason I was lurking at the edge of the room, looking for a polite exit strategy. But before I dive back into how that night unfolded, let me ask you something. If you've ever been the person standing on the fringe of someone else's happiness, watching from the dark and wondering if it will ever be your turn, tap that subscribe button right now, because the story belongs to you. Alright, let's head back to the floor. Song 1. It was a vintage track, Sinatra maybe, the kind of timeless tune that makes people who possess zero rhythm suddenly look graceful, simply because all you have to do is hold on to someone and sway. And let me tell you, she was an absolute disaster of a dancer. Genuinely terrible. She stepped right on my toes twice within the first 30 seconds and laughed out loud both times. A real, booming laugh that made nearby heads turn. I warned you, she said, looking up. You said you didn't dance. You didn't mention you were dangerous. I'm extremely dangerous. You should be terrified. She casually adjusted her grip on my shoulder. I'm Hannah Cole. I know who you are, I replied. That brought her up short. Tyler talks about you constantly, she explained. I'm Lauren's college roommate, the perpetually single friend marooned at table 9. She rolled her eyes dramatically. I've been stuck next to Lauren's divorced uncle all evening, and he's filled me in on the specs of his boat 4 separate times. I saw you standing over here looking every bit as thrilled as I was, and I figured one dance with a guy who isn't gonna drone on about watercraft sounded pretty good. I don't have a boat. See? We're already way ahead. I let out a genuine laugh. Honestly, I couldn't remember the last time I'd laughed at a wedding reception. When the song finally wound down, she started to pull away, but something heavy in my chest lurched. "One more," I said. She looked at me, caught off guard for a split second before a knowing look settled into her eyes. "One more." Song 2 brought a faster tempo. The floor quickly filled up around us, turning into a sea of moving bodies where actual dancing was nearly impossible. Nobody really dances to fast tracks at weddings. You mostly just bounce in place, but we stayed tucked close together. With the music thumping loudly overhead, talking became surprisingly easy, the kind of casual intimacy where you naturally lean in close to be heard. She asked what I did for a living, and I told her. Then she asked what part of this venue I was responsible for. The wooden arch, the floor, the head table. I listed off. She glanced down at the polished planks beneath our shoes, then back up into my eyes. "You built this? This exact floor we're standing on?" "Yeah." "You built the most breathtaking part of your best friend's wedding, and you were just hanging out in the corner by yourself?" "I build them," I murmured. "I don't use them." She tilted her head, curious. "Why not?" To this day, I still don't fully understand why I answered her. I never talk about it with anyone. But the bass was vibrating through the floorboards. She was standing inches away, and she was looking at me like my answer genuinely mattered. The words just slipped out. "My brother, Ryan, got married 4 years ago," I said, keeping my eyes fixed on a point just past her shoulder. "I was his best man. I built his entire wedding venue too, the arch, the floor, every last detail. It was the last time I ever stepped onto a dance floor." I paused, swallowing hard. "He died 2 years later in a car wreck. Black ice on Route 35 coming home from a late shift." Hannah didn't flinch. She didn't offer a hollow expression of pity, and she didn't put on that practiced sympathetic face. She just asked softly, "What song? What was the last song you danced to at his wedding?" In 2 years filled with polite condolences, sympathy casseroles, and well-meaning platitudes about how he was in a better place, not a single person had ever thought to ask me about the music. "The way you look tonight," I answered. "I danced with his wife, Sarah. She chose it because Ryan couldn't carry a tune to save his life, but he'd belt that one out in the shower every single morning. She said it was the only song where he knew all the lyrics." Hannah stayed silent for a quiet beat. "You build wedding venues," she said slowly. "You've built 60 of them, and you refuse to dance because the last time you did, it was at your brother's wedding. As if stepping onto someone else's floor means it's somehow not his anymore." "Yeah." She nodded, not with the empty look of someone trying to be polite, but with the quiet clarity of someone who truly understood. "Okay, then there's something I need to tell you before the next song starts." Song 3. The band brought the tempo right back down with a sultry Etta James tune. The overhead lights dimmed, couples drifted closer together, and the room took on that classic, amber-hued, half-intoxicated wedding glow. Hannah placed both her hands gently on my shoulders, looking up since she was shorter than me. 3 years ago, I was engaged," she told me quietly. "His name was Will, and he was a paramedic. He proposed on a random Tuesday because he said he didn't want to waste time waiting for a weekend." A flicker of a bittersweet smile touched her lips. "We were supposed to get married in October. What happened?" "He answered a house fire call in July." She delivered the words flatly, with the rehearsed detachment of someone who has repeated a tragedy so many times the sharp edges have worn away. "He went inside. The floor collapsed. They managed to get him out, but she gave a small, sorrowful shake of her head. For 3 days I stopped functioning entirely. The last time I danced, she continued, was at the hospital on our last night. I played music from my phone, held his hand, and swayed right beside his bed because he couldn't move and my grief wouldn't let me sit still. I haven't danced since. Not once. Not at a single wedding. She looked up, her gaze piercing. I go to all of them because Lauren drags me along, and I love her. I sit at my assigned table. I clap, I smile, and I never, ever step foot on the floor, until tonight. She searched my face. I saw you standing over there, Cole. I don't know what it was, but you looked just like me. You looked like a ghost. Someone who was physically in the room, but miles away inside your own head. And I thought to myself, if I'm ever going to dance again, it has to be with someone who actually understands what it costs. We stood frozen right there in the middle of the dance floor I had hammered together with my own hands. Two broken people, each of whom had frozen in time on the day they lost the person they loved most. The music washed over us. We didn't sway and we didn't let go. That quiet stillness was its own kind of dance. We're a complete mess, she whispered against my shoulder. An absolute disaster, I agreed. One more song. Yeah, I said softly. One more. Song 4 rolled around, and the crowd was finally beginning to thin out. It was getting late, past 11. The older folks had headed home for the night. The heavy drinkers were lingering around the bar, and the deeply connected couples were slow dancing in quiet corners with their eyes shut. But Hannah and I were still standing right in the dead center of the room. Can I tell you something a little weird? She asked abruptly. Shoot, go for it. I've actually seen you before tonight, 3 weeks ago. She pulled back just enough to look me in the eye. I came over to help Lauren set up the barn, and you were here building the structural arch. You had sawdust tangled in your hair, and you were literally talking out loud to the lumber. I do not talk to the wood, I protested, feeling a faint smile tug at my lips. You talk to the wood. You whispered, come on, stay with me. To a piece of cedar that was starting to split. That isn't talking. That's basic carpentry. She grinned. I watched you for 20 minutes while you had no idea I was even there, and I thought, well, I don't really know what I thought. It was something about the way your hands touched the timber, like it actually mattered, like you were crafting something for someone you deeply loved instead of just knocking out a client job. I didn't say anything to you back then. I asked Lauren about you that very night, she admitted, her gaze steady and unblinking. She told me about Ryan. Lauren told you? Lauren told me everything. She told me you've built 60 venues and never once danced on a single one. She told me you wear your late brother's silver cuff links to every single wedding you work. She told me you refuse to step on the floor because doing so feels like letting go of him. Hannah's hand slid down my forearm to my wrist. Her fingers brushed against the cool metal of Ryan's cuff link, engraved with his initials. And in that moment I thought of Will and I realized I was guilty of the exact same crime. I drag myself to every wedding, anchor myself to a lonely table, and clutch my grief tightly to my chest like it was the final tangible piece of him I had left. She slowly turned the cuff link over beneath her thumb. And right then, she said softly, before I ever walked over to you tonight, I made up my mind. I decided that if you were brave enough to say yes to just one dance, even just one, then maybe I was finally allowed to stop holding on quite so desperately. Because a man who pours his soul into building floors but refuses to dance on them would surely understand. She tilted her chin up. You said yes, Cole. You said yes, and then you asked for one more 3 separate times. We've been out here dancing for an hour and a half, and you haven't let go of my hand once. I glanced down. She was right. I hadn't. And then I did the absolute dumbest thing of my entire life. I let go. I took a hard step backward and watched the light instantly drain from her face, as if someone had flicked off a switch behind her eyes. I can't do this, I said, my voice tight. Hannah, you came out here looking for a guy who's ready to move forward, and I'm simply not. I build these floors. I don't use them. That's the whole point. I've been standing safely at the edge for 2 whole years because stepping onto the floor means accepting that Ryan is really gone. It means the last dance is truly the last dance, and I can't. You think I came over here because I'm ready? She let out a sharp, joyless laugh that held no humor at all. Cole, I haven't danced in 3 years. I wear Will's wedding ring on a silver chain tucked beneath my shirt every single day. I RSVP'd to this wedding completely alone for the 6th year in a row. I am the absolute definition of not ready. She took a sharp breath, her chest rising. But I am standing here right now, and so are you. Ready is just a comforting lie people tell themselves so they never have to actually take the first terrifying step. She held her hands straight out. Get back over here. I didn't let you step on my feet 6 times just to watch you walk away now. I stared down at her outstretched hand, then looked back at the polished wood beneath our feet. My floor. The exact floor I had poured my sweat into building for Tyler and Lauren. The exact same way I'd built one for Ryan and Sarah, and 60 others for 60 different couples, while hiding in the shadows and telling myself that the act of building was enough. Slowly, I reached out and took her hand. There, she whispered with a faint smile. Was that really so hard? Yes, I admitted honestly. That was easily the hardest thing I've done in 2 years. Good, she said firmly. Difficult things are the only ones at weddings that are actually worth doing. Everything else is just cake. The band seamlessly kicked into the next track. She didn't move away, and neither did I. One more, she said, though this time it wasn't framed as a question. Every single song they've got left, I replied. Song 5. This was the one that completely wrecked me. The band leader leaned close to the microphone and announced that they had one final number before closing out the night. A special request put in by the bride herself, Lauren, specifically for the final dance of the evening. The opening notes drifted through the speakers, and my entire body instantly went ice cold. The Way You Look Tonight, Ryan's song, the exact tune he used to belt out in the shower every morning. The one I had spun around to at his wedding with his wife. The one I hadn't been able to bear hearing played at a wedding since the night before everything in my world broke. I froze dead in my tracks on the floor. Hannah felt the sudden tension in my frame immediately. She looked up, caught the stark expression carved across my face, and understood everything in an instant. This is the song, she whispered. I couldn't form words. I couldn't even draw a breath. I was standing on a masterpiece of wood that I had built with my own hands, hearing that exact melody fill the room, and for a terrifying second, I was 26 years old again, dancing with Sarah while Ryan was still alive and the world was whole. Hannah didn't yank me away from the center of the room. She didn't offer a hollow assurance that it would be okay, and she didn't try to minimize the pain. Instead, she stepped closer, pressed her palm flat against my chest, and said in a voice barely louder than a breath, "He'd want you to dance." I know, I choked out, my voice cracking completely. I know he would. Then stay with me. Don't sit down. Not now. Not for the last one. Across the dimly lit room, I caught sight of Lauren watching us from afar, and the pieces finally clicked into place. Lauren had requested that song on purpose. She knew all about Ryan and understood what the melody meant to me. She knew Hannah had crossed the room to find me, and she had placed that specific song at the very tail end of the night like a door deliberately left wide open. So I stayed. I danced to my late brother's favorite song alongside a woman who intimately understood the heavy toll it exacted from me, standing on a floor I had built but spent years avoiding. I stood in a room full of strangers and cried openly, and for the first time I didn't care who saw. Hannah held on to me tightly, refusing to let go. When the final note finally faded into silence, she was still right there, holding my hand. "We didn't sit down," she murmured.
No, irraplia sufli.
"We didn't. And honestly, I don't want to start now. Neither do I." We left that wedding together, not in a frantic rush, and not making some dramatic theatrical exit. We simply walked side by side out into the cool midnight air of a Dayton parking lot, her hands securely locked in mine. We were two bruised people who had spent years constructing impenetrable fortresses out of grief, isolation, and empty chairs. Yet a single night, 5 songs, and 4 hours had quietly dismantled every single wall we built. I drove her home and parked in her driveway, where we sat together in the cab of my truck for an entire hour. She finally opened up about Will, the real details like his impulsive Tuesday proposal, the silly shower songs he sang too, and the way he'd eat a bowl of dry cereal for dinner and call it cooking. In return, I told her the unvarnished truth about Ryan. The black ice, the crushing phone call, and the silver cuff links I'd stubbornly worn to every wedding since because taking them off felt like erasing him. "You don't ever have to take them off," she said gently, brushing her thumb over the cool metal at my wrist. "You just have to stop standing shivering at the edge." We didn't rush anything. After a night like that, you don't sprint through the aftermath. You've already laid your heaviest truths bare, and rushing the easy conversations would feel like an insult. But we didn't retreat to our corners either. Not once. During the first week, she started showing up at my workshop, watching me work while sipping black coffee, no sugar, a detail she'd casually asked Tyler about. She'd perch herself on a wooden sawhorse and quietly read a book while I hammered and sawed. The comfortable silence between us was the rare kind that signaled someone was actually there to stay, not just passing through. One evening that week, as I was setting down a heavy mug, she caught my wrist and turned my cuff link up toward the warm workshop light. "R.S.," she read aloud. "Ryan Sullivan." "Yeah, there's actually an inscription on the back," I admitted. She flipped it over to inspect the reverse side. I had never shown the back of those cuff links to a single living soul. There, scratched deep into the silver with the tip of a pocket knife in Ryan's messy, half-drunk handwriting the night before his wedding, were 4 simple words. "Dance, you coward." Hannah traced the letters with her finger, read them under her breath, and then looked up at me with fierce, blazing eyes. "Your brother literally engraved dance, you coward, onto the cuff links you wear to every single wedding where you stubbornly refuse to dance?" "Yeah," I confessed, rubbing the back of my neck. "He was kind of a jerk about it." He was completely right. She tightened her grip on my wrist. "And you've known this for 2 whole years? You've been walking around wearing his answer on your sleeve every time you stood miserably at the edge of the room." I didn't have a defense for that because she was entirely right. Ryan had left me a literal set of instructions carved into silver, telling me exactly what to do, and I had worn his words to 60 weddings without ever actually doing what they commanded, until she walked in. By the first month, I built her a custom bookshelf. She hadn't even asked for one. Her apartment floor was cluttered with teetering stacks of paperbacks because she was the type of person who would buy 10 new books before ever clearing space for a single one. While she was away at work, I quietly measured her living room wall, built the piece down at the shop, and installed it on a Sunday morning. I need to tell you about crafting that shelf because it holds weight. The Saturday night before, I was out in the shop at midnight, sanding down the final back panel, and I did something I had never once done on a client piece. Using a sharp chisel, I carved a tiny, hidden message into the reverse side of the board, the flat part that presses flush against the wall where nobody will ever lay eyes on it. Just 5 small words. She asked for one dance. I don't know why I did it. I just needed it anchored somewhere in the wood, like an old-fashioned date carved into the cornerstone of a building. When she came home that Sunday, she stood frozen in her living room doorway for a full minute without uttering a word. "You built me a bookshelf?" she finally breathed out. "My books were just piled on the floor. You noticed? And you actually built me a bookshelf?" "Yeah, that's pretty much what I did." She walked slowly over to it, running her fingertips gently along the polished grain of the oak, the exact same way I'd watched her trace the edge of my cuff link. "It's gorgeous," she whispered. "It's quite literally the most thoughtful thing anyone has ever given me." She had no idea the inscription was hidden back there, and she wouldn't discover it for a long time, not until we eventually moved in together and had to detach it from the wall, revealing those 5 words carved into the timber. When she found it, she sat right down on the floor of our empty apartment and cried over a wooden bookshelf the exact same way some women cry over diamonds. And that was the moment I knew for certain I was marrying the right person. But that came much later. On that particular Sunday afternoon, she pulled me close and kissed me for the very first time right there in her hallway, smelling faintly of sawdust and black coffee while I was still holding a power drill in my hand. 0 traditional romance and absolute perfection. By the 3rd month, I finally managed to take her out to Ryan's gravesite. I hadn't been able to face going there alone for over a year. Hannah volunteered to drive, keeping quiet for the entire ride, and when we arrived, she simply stood shoulder to shoulder with me while I poured my heart out to a slab of stone, never rushing me or trying to fill the quiet spaces with nervous chatter. When I finally finished, she slipped her arm through mine and said softly, "He sounds like someone I would have genuinely liked." "He would have loved you," I replied. "He probably would have relentlessly made fun of your terrible dancing style before dragging you onto the grass to dance anyway. That irritating trait seems to run straight through the family," she noted with a quiet smile. A week later, it was my turn to take her out to Will's resting place, a different cemetery in a different town, requiring a 40-minute drive that she made in total silence, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. As I sat beside her, I completely understood that heavy stillness. It was the exact same mental rehearsal I ran through every time I drove out to Ryan's grave, spending 40 minutes preparing what you plan to say, only to arrive and realize words are entirely inadequate. Will's headstone was simple, just his name, the dates, and a short quote she told me he had hand-picked years earlier, like a running joke that turned out not to be funny after all. "He was a paramedic," she said, standing rigidly in front of the marker with her arms tightly crossed over her chest. "He always instinctively ran straight toward the fire. Literally, that's what ended up costing him his life. But it's also the exact thing that made Will. I've never quite figured out how to make peace with being furiously angry at the very traits I fell in love with. I didn't offer any hollow platitudes. I simply stepped in and stood right beside her, offering the exact same quiet solidarity she had given me. After a long pause, she turned to me. "I've never brought a single soul out here before." "I know," I answered gently. "I'm bringing you because I need Will to know I'm not trying to replace him." Her voice cracked slightly on the edges. "I need him to understand that the man I'm falling for builds things out of wood instead of blindly running into burning buildings. And that isn't a betrayal of his memory, it's just different. Simply a different kind of brave. The slow, steady kind." She looked up at me, her face a tear-streaked mess, and to me, she was the most breathtaking person on earth. "Am I asked softly, "the man you're falling for?" "Cole, I danced with you for 4 solid hours when I hadn't stepped on a floor in 3 years. Exactly what part of that equation do you think is happening here?" Fair point. By the 6-month mark, Sarah, Ryan's widow, finally met Hannah for the very first time during a casual Sunday dinner. I was ridiculously nervous about it in a way I couldn't quite articulate, like trying to introduce two completely separate halves of myself that I'd spent years keeping locked in different rooms. But Sarah spent the whole evening quietly observing us. The effortless way Hannah's hand brushed against my arm without her even thinking about it, and the way I instinctively leaned in closer whenever she spoke. After we finished eating, Sarah pulled me aside into the kitchen, her eyes suspiciously red. "She's the one, isn't she?" "Yeah," I admitted, a slow smile spreading across my face. "I think she really is. Ryan would be so furious with you for dragging your feet and making her wait this long." Sarah laughed through her tears, wiping her eyes. "He'd look at you and say, 'Cole, you absolute idiot. You built 60 different floors and never danced on a single one.'" She pulled me into a fierce, crushing hug. "Go dance on those floors, Cole. Stop building them exclusively for everyone else." We got married the following autumn. Naturally, I built the entire venue myself, the structural arch, the polished dance floor, and the head table. But this time around, when the band struck up their opening notes, I didn't lurk in the shadows near the back wall. I walked straight out to the center of the wooden floor I had crafted with my own hands, took my wife's hand, and we danced. Our first song was "The Way You Look Tonight." Hannah insisted on choosing it, saying Ryan deserved a seat at our wedding too, and the only way she knew how to bring him into the room was through the melody he used to belt out in the morning shower. I wore his silver cuff links proudly on my wrists. She wore a delicate locket containing a tiny photo of Will tucked safely inside her bridal bouquet, not hidden away out of shame, and not ostentatiously displayed, but simply carried. It was carried the exact same way you carry the memory of the people who helped guide you to the dance floor, even when they weren't permitted to stay. Tyler stepped up as my best man during the reception and gave a toast that brought the house down. "I've known Cole Sullivan since we were 12 years old," he told the crowd. "For the past 5 years, I've watched him build the most breathtaking dance floors in the state of Ohio, only to stand quietly in the back like he somehow didn't deserve to use them. He built mine. He built half of Dayton's venues. He built 60 of them in total. And looking back, every single one of those floors was actually built for the exact same person." He paused, looking straight across the room at Hannah. "He just didn't know her name yet." Lauren cried. Tyler choked up. I lost it entirely. Hannah caught my hand underneath the tablecloth, squeezing it once with firm, reassuring pressure. The exact same squeeze she gave me that first night on the floor, carrying that clear message. "I'm right here. Don't let go." We danced through every single song the band played that night. Every last one of them. When the reception finally wrapped up at midnight, we were the last 2 people left standing on the floor. Shoes kicked off, half intoxicated, her head resting comfortably right against my chest as we swayed to music that had long since stopped playing. We swayed simply because stopping felt far too much like sitting down, and we had made a promise to each other. It all started with just one dance at a Saturday night wedding in Dayton, Ohio, and neither of us has sat down since. I build dance floors for a living, 60 of them in total. 60 different stages I meticulously sanded, finished, and watched complete strangers use, while I stood awkwardly in the background with my brother's cuff links pressing into my wrists and my hands shoved deep in my pockets. For a long time, I genuinely believed that the act of building was enough. I thought that showing up, laying down the timber, and crafting something beautiful to support other people's love stories was the entirety of my job. I was dead wrong. The job was never just about building the floor. The real job was finally getting the courage to step onto it. She asked for a single dance. I gave her that one, then asked for one more, then another until I'd claimed every remaining song the band had, followed by every song after that for the rest of my life. You don't find that kind of connection by standing on the sidelines and constructing things for other people. You don't find it by lingering safely at the edge. You earn it by looking someone dead in the eye, saying yes even when you're just as terrified as they are, and refusing to leave the floor until the music stops. Our music hasn't stopped yet, and I honestly don't think it ever will.